Much of Parshat Vayetze centers on the birth of the soon-to-be 12 tribes. We read how Yaakov moved from bachelorhood to become a husband to 4 wives and father of 12 children in an extremely short time span. In fact, a simple reading of the text implies that Yaakov sired his first 11 sons, from Reuven to Yosef, plus 1 daughter, Dinah, all within a window of just slightly over 6 years. To give a quick sense of the basis for these calculations, Yaakov says to Lavan, Hava et ishti ki mal'u yamai, give me my wife, for my years are complete, presumably referring to his initial stint of 7 years of labor for Lavan. Thus, it would appear that Yaakov first married Leah only after this first set of 7 years. As such, Reuven, the first son, could not have been born until towards the end of the 8th year. After marrying Leah, and immediately afterwards marrying Rachel, Yaakov then works for another 7 years. In a later verse, Vayhi ka'asher yalda Rachel et Yosef, Vayomer Yaakov Lavan, Shalcheni ve'alcha mekomi u'la'artzi. The Torah implies that Yosef, the 11th and last son born in Haran, was born upon the conclusion of this second set of 7 years. If so, this leaves only about 6 years for all of these children to be born. These calculations, though, raise several problems, both within our story and regarding 2 stories later in Sefer Breshit. In our story, given the fact that there are 4 different mothers, 12 children being born in 6 years is not troubling, as some of their pregnancies could have easily overlapped. However, 7 of the children are born by Leah alone. This, too, is not in itself impossible, but given the fact that in the middle, Leah stops bearing children for at least long enough to decide to give her maidservant to Yaakov, we wonder how all her births, plus the hiatus in which she did not conceive, could fit into such a short time frame. The chronology presented for the births also affects the later story of the rape of Dinah and the avenging of her honor by Shimon and Levi in Breshit 34. We know from Yaakov's words to Lavan, Zeli esrim shana beveitecha, avadticha 14 shana b'shtei v'notecha, v'shesh shanim b'tzonecha, that he lived by Lavan for 20 years, spending 14 years working for Rachel and Leah, and another 6 working for his own sheep. The text implies that the story of Shechem occurred soon after, when Yaakov was en route from Lavan back to his father in Hebron, a trip which likely did not take more than 1 to 2 years. As such, if Shimon and Levi were born at the end of the 9th and 10 years of Yaakov's stay in Haran, as suggested by the time frame we discussed earlier, this would make them just 12 or 13 when they wiped out the entire city of Shechem. Dinah, being the last of Leah's children born, would herself have only been about 7 or 8. We wonder, is that a plausible reading of the story? Finally, one last piece of the puzzle relates to the story of Yehuda and Tamar in Breshit 38, and the list of descendants who come down to Egypt in Breshit 46. In the course of the chapter, Yehuda marries, has 3 children who arrive at marriageable age, and only then sires 2 additional children from Tamar, Peretz and Zerach. Breshit 46 states that by the time Yaakov and his family descended to Egypt, Peretz himself had produced 2 children, Chetor and Hamor. However, if one assumes that Yehuda was born in the 10th year of Yaakov's sojourn in Haran, he would have only been 43 years old at the time of the descent, and already produced the equivalent of 3 generations worth of progeny. These questions make us wonder whether our calculations above might have been flawed, and if there are perhaps any alternatives to our chronological reconstruction. Commentators offer an array of possibilities through which to resolve the issues, and they are pretty consistent in the methodologies that they employ for each of the 3 problems. A first approach, which we might call the supernatural approach, taken by Seder Olam Rabbah, one of the earliest midrashim, resolves all of our issues by suggesting that all of these events happened miraculously. It takes the stories literally, preferring not to tamper with the chronology suggested by the simple reading of the text. Thus, Seder Olam Rabbah posits that all 12 pregnancies and births were consecutive, but nonetheless fit into 7 years. This forces Seder Olam Rabbah to maintain that the duration of each of these 12 pregnancies was only 7 months. While not impossible, this would seem to be highly improbable unless there was an overt miracle. Seder Olam Rabbah resolves the Shimon and Levi issues in a similar manner, suggesting that they were indeed only 13 or so during the massacre of Shechem, but miraculously physically mature enough to take on the entire city. Likewise, it assumes that Yehuda really did produce 3 generations worth of progeny in just 22 years, postulating that each of Yehuda's descendants procreated at the young age of 7. As we read these solutions, we wonder why the Midrash prefers to posit miracles rather than play slightly with the chronology of the verses. After all, Seder Olam Rabbah is not averse to positing a chronology and saying Ein Mukdam Umuchar B'Torah. Elsewhere, it turns entire stories on their heads. For example, it has no problem suggesting that the covenant between the pieces took place when Avram was 70, 5 years before he was commanded Lach Lecha and uprooted to Canaan. So why in our story does the Midrash prefer the miraculous reading? Rabag writes, Ze kulo haya mimin hagam, lahaflik bechozek hahashgacha elokit ulefarsim inyana el hahamon. This is part of the Midrashic tendency to exaggerate miracles and highlight Hashem's providence. Miraculous births and precocious children show how the divine hand played a role in every aspect of our avot's lives. Not only did our barren mothers miraculously conceive, but even their pregnancies had supernatural elements, and their children supernatural maturity. Many other commentators prefer to take a more rationalist approach to the question, and do indeed solve our problem by making slight changes to the chronology presented in the verses. According to them, Tanakh at times prefers thematic order over chronological order, leading, for example, to the initial impression that the births were consecutive, when in fact they were not. Thus, Ibn Ezra, a 12th century commentator, suggests that despite appearances, some of the pregnancies overlapped. He adds that perhaps Zvulun and Dinah were twins, making the rate of Leah's birthing more feasible. This might even be hinted at in the verses, which mention only Dinah's birth, but no preceding pregnancy. By the rest of Leah's children, we always read, Vatahar vateled, she conceived and she bore. But by Dinah, the text only states, V'achar yalda bat, and afterwards she bore a daughter. Ibn Ezra similarly solves the problems of Shimon, Levi, and Dinah's ages in the Shem story. Here too he suggests a slight chronological emendation, that Yaakov and his family lived in Shem for several years before the rape and massacre took place, allowing for a much older set of siblings. Finally, to solve the issue of Yehuda's offspring, Ibn Ezra again posits a slight achronology, suggesting that the beginning of Breshit 38 overlaps with the earlier stories and really occurred beforehand. It is placed where it is for thematic reasons, allowing the entire Yehuda and Tamar story to be read together. The extra years gained by setting Yehuda's initial marriage before the sale of Yosef allow for the possibility that Yehuda and his descendants each sired children at the more plausible age of 13. In contrast to the Midrash, then, Ibn Ezra avoids supernatural explanations, managing to deal with the textual problems by suggesting only relatively minor rearrangements of the order of the events. A third position, like that of Ibn Ezra, approaches the issues from a more rationalist perspective, but suggests that our earlier calculations, which allowed for only 7 years' worth of pregnancies and births, were mistaken, and that really the births took place over a period which was closer to 14 years. This approach subdivides regarding how to find those additional years. Do we add them to the beginning or to the end of our time frame? Ralbag, a 14th century Provençal commentator, suggests that we add them to the beginning, maintaining that Yaakov married Leah not at the end of his first 7 years of labor, but before they began. He writes, V'hinei kodem she'atchil Yaakov ba'avodah, amar Yaakov leLavan, hava et ishti ki zakanti umal'u yamai, va'avoa eleha kedi she'olid mimena. Va'amnam, אמר זה, לפי שכבר היה אז ליעקב יותר מ-77 שנים, ולזה לא ייתכן שימתין שתשלם העבודה. According to Rabag, the phrase כי מלאו ימי does not mean because I have finished my years of service, but because I'm getting on in years. As Yaakov was already 77, he asked if he could have his wife up front. This reading easily solves all the issues raised above. In an expanded 14-year time frame, Leah can not only bear 7 children, but also nurse them, and still have a hiatus in the middle where she could not conceive. One need not posit that any births overlapped or that there were twins, as even if all 12 births were consecutive, they can fit into 14 years. The new chronology takes care of our other problems as well, as it makes Shimon and Levi not young boys, but adults of approximately 20 at the time of the incident in Shechem. Similarly, Yehuda can be 50 years old upon his arrival in Egypt, with ample time for multiple generations of the descendants to have sired their own children. At first glance, then, Rabag's approach seems fairly solid. Abarbanel, though, points to one potentially fatal flaw in the reconstruction. In Bereshit 29, verse 20, before Yaakov's request, Havat ishti kimal uyamai, we read, Vayavod Yaakov b'Rachel sheva shanim, suggesting that he had already worked for Rachel by the time he requested, give me my wife. There are ways to defend Rabag, but they're somewhat complex. Anyone who's interested should see the discussion at al-hatorah.org. With this, we move to one final position. Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, a 20th century German commentator, expands the time frames of the birth like Rabag, but does so by adding years in the end rather than at the beginning. According to him, Yosef was born only several years after Yaakov had already completed both of his 7-year stints. He writes, Ach ein hechreach lahaniach, ki amnam nolad Yosef besof hashana hashvi'it, ki yitachen af yitachen sheYaakov od shahazman ma becharan achar tom sheva shnot avodah, zman shebo lo haya chayav od la'avod lelavan. But there is no necessity to assume that Yosef was born at the end of the 7th year, because it's very possible that Yaakov spent some time in Haran after finishing the 7 years of work when he no longer had obligations to Lavan. According to Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, after finishing his 14 years of service to Lavan, Yaakov might have stayed in Haran for any number of years, working at random jobs by other employers. Yosef was born only at the end of these unmentioned years, at which point Yaakov renegotiated his employment with Lavan and worked for his father-in-law for another 6 years. As such, Yaakov might have been in Haran for even 25 or more years. If so, though, we must reinterpret Yaakov's later statement to Lavan, Zeli esrim shana beveitecha, avarticha 14 shana b'shtei vinotecha, v'shesh shanim b'tzonecha. According to Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, Yaakov is not referring to the number of years he spent in Haran, but only to the years he spent in Lavan's employ. Given these extra years, all the issues are resolved. There is ample time for all the births. Shimon and Levi can be adults capable of killing all the males in the city of Shechem, and Yehuda has enough years to sire several generations' worth of offspring before the descent to Egypt. To summarize, we have seen 3 different approaches to our topic. Seder Olam Rabbah resolves the textual problems by positing that events were miraculous, while Ibn Ezra does so by suggesting minor chronological changes to the story, recognizing that the Torah sometimes prefers thematic ordering over chronology. Rabag and Rav David Tzvi Hoffman instead expand the time frame of the events by rereading certain verses in novel ways. These varying methodologies can be employed to resolve not only the textual issues in our stories, but similar ones throughout Tanakh. For more on this and for other topics related to Parshat Vayetze, please visit al-hatorah.org.